Hello again. Uh, Today we're moving to something a little different, but still in continuation of what we did yesterday. This time I'll try to introduce you to stylometric networks to show you how social network analysis, as it's called, uh, mm, uh, can help stylometry. I've already alluded to some of the reasons. I'll go yesterday. I'll go into details in a moment. So first of all, the question is why network analysis? When applied to stylometry, especially stylometry by most frequent words using cluster analysis and other statistical methods, as I illustrated yesterday. Single cluster analysis trees, like this one, for instance, you might remember our results, show just one result for one parameter, such as just 100 most frequent words. And as you can see, sometimes the result might be wrong, while results for other parameters are more reliable. So this is reason one to do network analysis. The second reason is that when you try to overcome the problem with single analysis and you use bootstrap consensus trees to combine a number of individual cluster analyses into an overall picture of the results, you only get the strongest signals, the strongest similarities. This diagram shows just who is closest to whom, but totally ignores any possible similarities between texts that are not that close to each other. In fact, texts by different authors, and that is always something we should be taking into account. Also, as you might remember from yesterday, sometimes when you have a lot of texts, the diagrams can be very crowded and become unreadable. And so what that this diagram beautifully shows by its patches of color that English translations of French novels still stick mostly together by the original author. That is a result we very often get in stylometric studies in literary translation. Still, we cannot really rely on this to give us a very good image, simply because we can barely read the labels of these in this diagram. Now, perhaps even a better reason to do network analysis is that network analysis is used in all kinds of fields, from physics and biology to social studies. Why not then in stylometric studies of, say, literature or translation? What network analysis does is that it offers clear visualization of patterns of similarity and difference within and inside and between various groups of, in our case, texts, which in network analysis we call communities. The good thing about network analysis is that, contrarily to bootstrap consensus trees, it can show both strong and weak similarities, and it also uses the strength and the weaknesses of those similarities to present a balanced view of that pattern in a group of texts. In other words, these are all very good reasons, and perhaps the best reason of all that is some of those results can be really, really pretty. Now, the piece of software I'll be introducing here and that we'll be using in the hands-on session later on is called Gephi. It's fairly intuitive and free Java-based software. You can download it all from gephi.org. You have the authors and the the first presentation publication that accompanies it. Well, when I say Gephi is fairly intuitive, it is pretty easy to use after you become familiar with some of its little quirks. It's also in a non 1.0 version still, despite all those years. So it does sometimes have little irritating bugs, but in general, it's still the best thing we can get. Now, the good news is that Stylo is ready to work with Gephi, as it produces an output CSV file, a comma separated file, and which is ready to use as input in Gephi. The structure of such a file is very easy. It has it usually has in one line. It usually has the name of one text, the name of another, and the strength of the similarity, the weight that connects those two texts. Okay, let's go for a couple of details, and let's go back to what I already mentioned today and also yesterday. The diagram of French literature in English, this time, however, with a little twist. So remember how crowded the Bootstrap consensus tree was. Let's now see if we can do something better. Just to show you what we have here, we have a fairly large collection of texts by some of the most classical French writers, and but obviously we're dealing with them in English, and they have been translated by a big number of different human translators, but also by DeepL and Google Translate, and that is the twist. We'll see how good DeepL and Google Translate are in translating French literature into English, at least from the point of view of quantitative stylometric analysis. So here goes. This is our network. Now, how do we read this network? Whatever is connected to anything else, or whatever two texts are connected with each other, this means they are similar in some way. Again, we're only speaking of similarity in the usage of the very frequent words. Of course, we remember that. Now, further into the reading of this visualization, the closer two texts are to each other, and the thicker line connect one text to another, the stronger the similarities. If you want, the visualization is based on a gravitational algorithm, which does something like, well, imagine we have a bundle of rubber bands, and some of the rubber bands are thick and some of the rubber bands are very thin. Now, when you start pulling, that is applying gravitational force on this bundle, some of the rubber bands, the thick ones, won't allow to be dragged very far away one from another. The thin ones will. And as this gravitational force is mathematically applied to this network, this eventually creates a balance where one very strong, one very wide band or connection can be balanced by a number of thinner ones. And this is how it's done. You can see again by the patches of color that the texts that the French books in English translation tend to cluster by original author. Again, well, it's still somewhat surprising, except that we've already seen this such an effect. But let's take a closer look. Let's zoom in and see what happens here. Now, you will notice that the labels contain the name of the original author, like Flaubert, a part at least of the title, like Herodias, and the name of the translator, in this case, an anonymous translator, or GT stands for Google Translate, and DL stands for DeepL. Now, you will see that in most of those cases, the machine translations don't seem to be going very far away from translations of of the same text done by a human translator. In fact, what this shows us here, of course, we have a fragment of the network which only shows Flaubert, Zola, and Hugo. What this shows us that Google Translate, DeepL, have both become so good that they can translate literature in a way which can already fool quantitative stylometry into believing that they are very similar. In fact, they are quite similar when you analyze them to man-made translations. This is a big difference from what I saw a couple of years ago when I did the same study on Google Translate alone. There, Google Translate was always easily identifiable as a separate translator. Google Translate was really, really bad. Here, it seems like the growing pains of machine translation of literature are already over. Perhaps this is the beginning of the end of the profession of the literary translator, which would be very sad because what you probably don't know about me is I used to be one. What we also see in this picture, however, especially in this fragment, is that you might not remember in the original, Zola and Flaubert were stylometrically very similar, and they are still similar, not only in translation but in human and machine translation. We can see the same effect with Balzac and with France, with Jules Verne, and with Dumas, and there is also Sue and Dumas Jr., Dumas fils. There is a very interesting difference when we look at the red community here, the red Proust. As you can see, when compared to, say, Dumas, where the man-made translations are mixed together with DeepL and Google Translate, here, machine translations are at some distance, form a different community, a slightly separated sub-community, perhaps I should call it, from the other sub-community of man-made translations. See, most of that is by one translator, by Moncrief, which might be a factor here too. But you can see that contrary to the other authors, Proust is that kind of author whose machine translation is still not entirely unrecognizable from human translation. I find it's a very interesting result, and at the same time, a slightly worrying one. So much for French literature in English. Now, another case study, also in a way connected with translation, that of Elena Ferrante, as most of you probably know very well. Elena Ferrante is a very successful Italian writer. The only problem with her is that she does not really exist. Well, somebody writes her books, but at least officially, nobody knows the physical person, the hand that holds the pen or that types the keyboard. In 2016, an Italian investigative journalist, in fact, followed the money and realized that whenever a new book by Elena Ferrante appeared, Anita Raya, an Italian translator from the German, of Christa Wolf mostly, would buy a new swimming pool or a bigger house. And so Gatti was very happy to say that it was Anita Raya. Anita Raya said absolutely not. Now, as a former translator myself, I was sort of hoping it would be Raya. You probably do realize that translators have a horrible inferiority complex towards real writers, if I may call them that way. It would be, I sort of like the idea that it might be a translator who is discovered to be the true hand, the true face behind the anonymous Elena Ferrante. However, in 2017, two colleagues from the University of Padova, Aruna Tuzzi and Michele Cortolazzo, invited a dozen or so stylometrists from all over the world. I was part of that workshop. And on the 7th of September 2017, we all agreed, we all used different methods, and we all agreed that, okay, let me show you what we saw. So this is Anita Raya, who, as I've already said, never stated she really was Elena Ferrante. And our Italian colleagues have compiled a very nice collection of texts by Italian authors who at one time or another were suspected of being Elena Ferrante, and or of texts by authors who might have been Elena Ferrante as well, including translations of Anita Raya, the purple translations from Volve, they're all by Anita Raya. As you can see, doesn't seem it's her. There are no Elena Ferrante books anywhere here. The Elena Ferrante books are in an entirely different place, right here. And not only are they outside the main body of the text of the other Italian texts, but they are also outside in. They form a very distinct subcommunity with the writings of someone called Starnone, Domenico Starnone, and that's him. Now, Domenico Starnone is a well-known Italian writer who, believe it or not, is also the husband of Anita Raya, which would explain the swimming pools and the new houses. Now, as I said, the dozen international stylometrists all agreed it's him. Domenico Starnone reacted immediately, saying, "I am not Elena Ferrante." But we sort of decided not to trust him. Well, I was, of course, I was happy that my results were corroborated by 11 others colleagues. But again, I was a little sad that Anita Raya doesn't seem to be part of the story. But perhaps she is. You see, since 2017, other texts by Elena Ferrante appeared, including essays published in English, not originally in English, first published in English translations in The Guardian, and they were later published in Italian as a collection of essays. And look what happened. there they are. This text, the collection of essays, is now fairly close to some of the translations by of Wolf by Anita Raya. That suggests that either the Raya and Starnone partnership decided to do something about the results obtained by the stylometrists, or that she is somehow involved in this writing, or that, at the very least, she seems to be the hand behind the Ferrante essays. We still won't know until Raya and Starnone finally, stop pretending. But I think it's a very interesting story. Okay, enough scandal. Let's look into good old-fashioned literary studies, and let's look for some studies of chronology in individual authors. Here is Dickens, all the major novels. Now, this is obviously the results of a network analysis, and the color coding is something you should get used to, because this is what I use throughout this presentation. Green always denotes the earliest writings of an author. Later writings are yellow, orange, red, and purple. I call this the ripening aubergine scheme, even though I'm not really quite sure this is how the aubergines change color as they grow. Sorry about the vegetable story. Anyway, what is more, the coloring of the text was based not on anything the computer might or might not know. Green denotes the texts that are used by traditional Dickens scholars as the experimental period, the first period of Dickens's oeuvre. Then we have the yellow, which is the first period, or the second period, depending on how it's called, and then the mature period, which is red, and then the late period, the last three texts he wrote. You can see that the chronological evolution here is very, very strong. The same is true of another major author in English, Henry James. You can see how he too moves from green on the left to purple on the right. In fact, this is made even more obvious, this chronological evolution in James, in that James was an author who liked to rewrite some of his books, and Daisy Miller, his 1878 book, was later rewritten by him in 1909. Well, you can see that obviously it's very similar. These were not major rewrites, but you can see that the new version moves to the right, and the right is where older texts by James go. Now, it gets a little more interesting with Joseph Conrad, who does seem to follow some sort of evolutionary line from, in this case, top left to bottom right. However, there is one interesting element of this here. The Black Maid, a story Conrad claimed to have written well before he really started writing in English, which, as you know, was not his native language. It was his native language was Polish. Now, critics and biographers of Conrad, in fact, always doubted the veracity of that story, of the dating of that story. Here we can see that the critics were right and that Conrad was lying. I think call Konrad Elayer, we went to the same high school in Krakow, except that he did that a couple of years before me. Now, but if you're looking for something really nicely chronological, then this person, we've already discussed this Spanish writer yesterday, and now he's coming back today. Look how regular Galdós is in his Episodios Nacionales and in his novelas. It goes from the early ones all the way, this time from right to left, but that doesn't matter, all the way to his latest stuff. In a way, Galdós almost seems to be time perfect. In this case, this is probably the best example I've ever seen of chronological evolution in a writer. Okay, when you do the same thing to somebody like Molière, things change a bit. Well, you can see some chronological evolution here on the left, from green to dirty orange, but then things seem to go horribly wrong. Well, wrong if you absolutely want to see chronology. However, this diagram is even more interesting, perhaps even more surprising, because you see, you might already actually see that the division into two main communities is plays written in verse are on the left, plays written in prose are on the right, and to add insult to injury, the two plays that are in the middle are written half in prose, half in verse. Now, okay, before I saw this, the result of my study of Molière a couple of years ago, I would have never guessed that you use very frequent words and language differently and consistently differently, because this is what this diagram shows, whether you, depending on whether you write, whether you rhyme or you don't rhyme. That's fairly interesting, and that shows us that even within one author, we can see another signal, the signal of genre. Back to translation now. That is not my favorite part of this presentation, because it is probably going to show you that I am, or I was, not a very good translator. The title is Tinker Tailor Soldier Loser, which is an allusion, of course, to one of the more famous novels, spy thrillers by John le Carré. I happen to translate like 9 of his novels. So what this network consists of are translations of John le Carré by myself and many other Polish translators, the rivals, but also my translations of other authors and translations of other authors by all the other translators who translated Le Carré into Polish. Well, I am particularly ashamed of this part of the network. Anything that is green is mine. And you can see that the problem is that apparently whether I translate John le Carré or other authors like William Golding, Kazuo Ishiguro, Nadine Gordimer, they seem to be all sticking to one part of the network. They seem to be forming almost their own community. Which means, among other things, that the poor people who ever bought my translations and thought they were buying the books by Ishiguro or by Golding or by John le Carré, they in fact bought only me. And I don't remember getting a Nobel Prize like Ishiguro or Golding or Gordimer. Now, other translators of John le Carré also sort of have strong connections between their translations of le Carré. When you look at this one, for instance, the Purple Community of Paweł Korombel, well, he does seem to have his own signal, yet there is a clear division between his translations of Robin Cook and his translations of Kunz. However, what makes me even madder at myself is that this guy, R.J., Radosław Januszewski, while he has his own Le Carré signal, he can be very different when he translates someone like John Grisham. In fact, when he translates John Grisham, he can be like all the other Grishams, translated by other people. So, to make a long story short, perhaps this network analysis shows it's a good thing I don't really translate novels anymore. Thank God I'm over with this. Okay, one of my most recent studies, in fact, this is an ongoing study, is yes, you've seen it right. There are 13 Pinocchios in Polish. 13 Pinocchios which can be called translations rather than adaptations for even younger children. And you can see here that we do see a chronological evolution. So that is sort of another effect. We see a chronological evolution in a network analysis of translations of the same book. That's important. However, what is even more interesting is that here the coloring, the decision which texts should be treated as one community, as one group, was not made by a human looking at the network. Here, the decision which text to put in the same community, which text to use the same color for, was made by Gephi, by its modularity part, and the results are very reasonable. The green community of the three texts here in bottom left is that of the three earliest translations. And that makes a lot of sense. And then further on, it's as if network analysis in Gephi can actually tell time. Look, we have another group which are translations from the 90s, and the final group, the one colored red, except for just one text, is already from the 21st century. And that, I think, is again a very promising initial result for this study into this terrifying book. I mean, Pinocchio is terrifying. I don't think really kids should be reading this. Okay, now for something even bigger. And come on, you have to agree this is very, very pretty. Here is my network analysis of 3,200 texts in Polish. 2,000 are text originally written in Polish. 1,000, the remaining 1,000 are text translated into Polish from other languages. Let me explain to you what we see here. The relatively few dark green dots, the ones in this area, this is early pre-19th century Polish literature. Anything that's orange, clustering more or less here, this is 19th century Polish literature, especially 19th century Polish prose. Anything that's red, you can see that we're slowly but surely moving from left to right here, so the chronology works again, is 20th century Polish literature. And I think we also have a relatively less numerous dark purple fragment of 21st Polish literature. And then it gets interesting because quite at the extremity, we have the white dots that represent text translated from the English. And a little to the left, in gray, we have French prose fiction. Two things happen here. Both large bodies of translated literature, the English and the French, first of all, move away from the main body of native Polish literature. We've already seen this before. This is what we call translationese, if you want, stylometric translationese. But also, perhaps it's a coincidence, perhaps not, you see French literature moves sort of into a position which is parallel to that period of Polish literature in 19th and early 20th century, where French prose was the major influence on Polish writing. It was later replaced by English fiction, which again we see in the relative proximity of English prose fiction, of translated English prose fiction, into to late 20th and 21st century Polish literature. But there's more. There is Russian prose fiction, which, although some of its parts are situated a little away from the main body of Polish literature, there are at least two strands of Russian literature which mingle fairly freely with Polish literature, much more than do translations from French and translations from the English. This might be suggesting something that intuitively is very attractive, namely translations from more between similar languages result in less stylometric translationese. There are some other interesting effects here. Anything that's light green, this is Shakespeare in Polish. And light purple, in this fragment, this is Byron. There is a body of Polish literature which sort of slips in between Byron and Shakespeare. Now, anybody who knows anything about the evolution of Polish literature is quite happy to see that snuggling between Byron and Shakespeare is Polish Romanticism, which basically wanted to write like Shakespeare and Byron. That was basically the main part of the Polish Romantic manifestos. The orange parts are mostly poetry, and the light blue parts is Polish Romantic drama. Speaking of drama, there is another interesting community here. This one here. All this is our text of the Theatre of the Absurd, both native Polish and translations of French and English absurdists like Beckett, who did both languages, but Jean Genet and Harold Pinter and everybody else. So this is where, in fact, network analysis brings stylometry very close to Moretti's distant reading, if you want. And as I said, it's a very pretty picture. Okay, if your computer allows that, you can go a little further and see what happens when you take 10,000 texts in English this time, and also if you try to go 3D. enough of that. Sorry, I know it's a cheap trick, but I can never resist that. What I like about this crazy picture, however, is that it's almost a graphic metaphor of the modernist breakthrough, of the modernist revolution in writing. Again, the color coding is my usual, from very early dark green through green, yellow, and orange, and red until purple, and then white is anything published after the year 1900. You can see how the originally ordered evolution of literature in English suddenly explodes in all directions at around the same time that modernism explodes the existing literary tradition. Okay, even if it's just a metaphor, I think it's a very colorful one. Okay, we've already done this. So, before we get carried away, let's not forget that despite all those beautiful possible coincidences, all that is based on very frequent word statistics and nothing more. Obviously showing that it's a good idea to use very frequent words as the feature you count in quantitative stylometric studies. It might also show that we can do better. On the other hand, it might also show that there is something in language that we still do not know. And that, of course, would be very nice if it opened a new gateway into the mystery of language. There is little theoretical background. I mean, apart from the tons of paper covered with traditional literary scholarship, we don't really have a lot to use as theory. However, the results that I showed you and many more are fairly compelling, I think. There is what we can call a growing body of empirical evidence. Still, there are too many coincidences to just, to say it's only coincidence. The most thing about that is that in those quantitative studies, in those visualizations of literature, we can see signals of various aspects of literature. The strongest is the author, who apparently is not dead at all, since he or she or they can be visualized so clearly in any analysis that we use. There is chronology, which is strong, which in those huge networks, in the last two networks at least, can be in some way due to simple linguistic rather than literary evolution. However, remember the Dickens, the James, and especially the Gaudos diagrams. They show that this is not just linguistic, that there is a literary element there as well. The translator is interesting because sometimes the translators show up and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the translator can be concealed behind the strong signal of the original author. Sometimes the translator surfaces. Also, some translators do have their own signal, like sadly myself. Some other translators are pretty good at being a chameleon, at disguising the way they write, perhaps according to the author they translate at a given moment. Then there is genre, which has variable strength, and very often genre serves as the distorting factor when what you're really looking for is good, honest authorship attribution. And then there are other minor ties that minor signals that can also appear, like theme, gender, family ties. I mean, you've seen that there is something strange going on between Ferrante, Raya, and Starnone. What I did not show, for example, was how mysteriously similar text can be when authors happen to live in the same house. It's not just the Bronte sisters, and so at the end of this, very timidly, we can also say that perhaps what we're showing and what we're seeing is could be called style. Now, you might have noticed that I stayed away from the term style for 2 whole days, and I'm only mentioning it now, perhaps because this is the what is at the end, what we can see at the end of the road. Okay, I guess that's all for now in terms of introduction, and I understand there is now a hands-on session on Gephi going to happen. So see you there. Thank you.